This is our last lecture in this year's series, in which we have been welcoming an incredible group of scholars, practitioners, professionals operating in the urban realm. And I'm really excited to be here today with Evan, our last guest. My name is Maria Arquero de Alarcón, and I'm speaking on behalf of the University of Michigan. We are joining in this initiative as part of the Theories and Methods Seminar of Urban Design. And I'm doing this in the best company. I'm going to leave you with my colleague, Mona Al-Kafef.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Maria. My name is Mona Al-Kafif. I'm here an associate professor at the University of Virginia. And as Maria mentioned, the two of us had the fantastic idea to take advantage of the virtual environment that we are currently in. And we collaborated on a lecture series that is embedded into both our urban design seminars. And both of these seminars are a part of our urban design programs in each of our universities. Owning up to the urban, I want to quickly maybe give for everyone who's new to the lecture series a quick overview how we try to frame our common series. So it starts obviously with the quite common knowledge that we are urbanizing the planet, and that with this we are challenging all kinds of systems that are a part of it. But it's also really trying to call out, if this is the case, then we need to own up to the challenge, which means we have to find new ways to design our cities so that they become more sustainable and more just, and maybe also not only in a social but also in an environmental context. We need to own up to these problems. We need to work on new strategies, how to do this. And we invited a group of speakers this semester, a total of 7 speakers, who presented urban projects from very different angles and at very different scales. What they all had in common, though, is that they took leadership. They developed novel design strategies. They implemented projects one-to-one. They didn't wait for an assignment coming from a client or a city's administration. They crafted these projects themselves. They had either been exhibited and communicated, or they had been implemented. And it's really exciting to have this wide range of presenters who are all addressing novel ways of how we should design our cities. And with today's speaker, Evan, I think we have nearly a double contribution to the lecture series. On the one hand side, through the topic itself, which looks at transportation system and those who are going to be implemented probably in the future, but also the way how we are actually communicating these projects, probably to a general public, which means there's a need for political support, et cetera, et cetera. So I don't want to take the introduction of Evan from the students, but I just want to wrap this up maybe in the beginning, or frame it in the beginning. We developed a series of questions that all our presenters are going to, or did answer during the presentations. And I want to hand it over once more to Maria, who is going to introduce these questions.
At this point, we are all very familiar with the ways in which we are trying to bring all the work into conversation. We have these 7 prompts that are helping us to think a little bit, more specifically about how to establish relationships in between projects and ways of working. Always as designers, questioning our agency in the world, how actually the projects that we are involved in are advancing different ways of working. Are we solving problems? Are we developing projects and reading urban conditions? Are we theorizing present, past, and future? What are the ways in which our work is actually gaining a body, moving into the world? It's about innovating, it's about repairing, it's about empowering others in the partnerships that we establish. Are we anticipating conditions that don't yet exist? What are the methods? We ask many times the how to, right? How we know, how we develop, how we test. What are the actors, what are the partners that we have to establish coalitions with? How we find opportunities to work with others and to sustain the projects once the designer is gone. How we fund our work, right? What are the mechanisms that we have to bring funding streams to access novel ways of developing work that are in a way challenging the traditional relationship in between the designer and the client. And I think we have had many opportunities to see how really innovation is happening in the way in which designers are engaging in this particular aspect. And then last but not least, we have had already a very interesting conversation around issues of replicability, scalability, transferability. We have been discussing highly site-specific projects, but others that want to be prototypical. And we know that these are important conversations, important ways of working and testing our ideas. And in a way, they are, I think, generating some of the most important conversations that our students are bringing to our guests. So these are just some ways of, tending a common carpet so that many of the projects and many of the ideas that these lectures have been instigating can also be brought into conversation and put in relationship with each other. Mona, all yours.
So in recent weeks, obviously, we gave everyone an overview of the lectures to come. Today, we are at the end of our series, but just once more a reminder, we had a group of really fantastic speakers this semester covering strategies for the informal cities, like Naranafe last week, talking about Cairo, temporary urbanism, how games can be utilized to strategize about the city, landscape strategy. So we covered a larger territory, and it's really fascinating to see this once more all together. Just for everyone who's new here today, all of these lectures are going to be edited. Karim is already halfway done, and we will post these materials on our websites, and they will be available after the semester. So with this, I would like to hand it over to our student moderator team, who will guide us today through the evening. They will introduce our speaker and will also moderate the questions afterwards. Yuwei, Shuyu, Yazing, Yingju, Gigi, please thank you for taking the stage. And again, a lot of thanks to Karim, who's working in the background.
Hi, everyone. I will introduce our guest speaker, Evan Shieh, today. Evan Shieh graduated from GSD and is currently working as an intermediate designer at Henning Larsen. He has a unique style in storytelling and graphic design. He dedicates in exploring the public transit plan for LA and envisioning the possibility of transitioning from the utopia of today to a transitopia of tomorrow. So let's welcome Evan Shieh and enjoy his sharing.
Great, thank you. I'm gonna share screen now. Okay, everybody can see that?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So yeah, thank you so much, everybody. Thank you, Mona, and Maria for the invitation. It's a great introduction. My name is Evan, and I'm honored to be able to invite and share with you some ongoing research design work of mine titled Autonomous Urbanism Towards a New Transitopia, which, as Ewan mentioned, really looks at the future of cities and urbanism as it's affected by new technology, specifically the automated vehicle, or what I'm calling the AV. So this research was initiated when I was getting my urban design master's at GSD a few years ago, starting with my thesis, where actually Mona was on my final jury, providing great insight and comments. And it's continued since I graduated as a kind of personal research passion project, where I had the ability to kind of transition this into different exhibition methods and also link up with different stakeholders. So the format, as I think has been mentioned, the research takes is that of a graphic novel. But before we get to kind of how I arrived at this as a methodology, I want to kind of set the context, introduce kind of how and why this topic and this research is really actually so important. So I first became interested in this topic when I came across an article in 2018 on how Waymo, which is formerly Google's self-driving kind of technology arm, was launching its first commercial self-driving taxi service in Arizona in 2018. And at the time, I was a bit skeptical of autonomous technology, but seeing this technology hit the street already at that time as a commercial service actually really made me think immediately about what that impact of that technology would actually be on our work, you know, as architects and designers, how it's going to affect urban form and urban design in cities. The more I researched, the more I came across this law called, in technologist circle, they call it Amara's law, and on the effect of technology that states we tend to overestimate the effect of a technology in the short run and underestimate its effect in the long run. So Amara's law is closely tied to the Gartner Hype cycle, which is shown here, which delineates the maturity, adoption, and social effect of modern day technologies on our society. So it expresses how, as Amara stated, we tend to overestimate via mass media hype, the news, the effect of basically a technology trigger in the short term, and then become disillusioned with it, you know, in the medium term, which trends us to kind of towards underestimating its actual effect in the long run. So as I dive further and further into this topic, I realized how much literature on the subject and on media is really focused on this short term. There's this short-term preoccupation with it. And the framing of this is in the context of the autonomous vehicle is really particularly fascinating to consider, because I'd argue we'd somewhere actually be in this zone now in phase 2, where the kind of peak of inflated expectations and potentially even in this kind of trough of this disillusionment with the technology, which was maybe even sparked by some of the first negative press coming out where, you know, the first Uber AV struck and killed the first human in 2019. But as an architect and urban designer, I was always fascinated and interested by how this will actually affect our cities long term. And the more and more I dived into this study, I found that there was really not much literature looking at urbanism and city building long term from the perspective of, you know, us as designers. Today, at the forefront of this is really huge tech companies like Google and Uber and Lyft that are pushing for commercial rollout, while at the same time, really slow reacting public agencies wait to see how emerging tech is going to impact the actual evolution of cities. So I thought, you know, is there another voice that needs to advocate for the potential kind of radical city building dimension, you know, the urban form that will inevitably be affected by automation? You know, is there a vision or a goal for this future that we can strive for, you know, and mediate many of these stakeholders? So historically, technology has always had a really intricate relationship with the urban growth of our cities. So understanding this symbiosis, I argue that we really need to think of the incoming AV revolution not only as new technology, but rather as new infrastructure that will have profound effects on urban growth patterns. Only by understanding the autonomous vehicle as new infrastructure can we conceive of it as a potential new system of mobility with its blessings and its flaws, just as the introduction of the locomotive or the automobile technology became foundational infrastructure for the planning of the cities in their respective eras. We also have to remind ourselves that despite the dominance of car culture today in the US, it's just one of many mobility and transportation types used to get around the city and also plan our cities upon. So we have to recognize that with the introduction of the AV, we have to consider it with these larger kind of broader issues and frameworks of mobility at large, which is really reflective of cultural behavioral norms. And it's reflective of the idea that how we choose to move around the city really has vast implications on how the city is planned and evolves, both at the regional scale, regional kind of urban growth models, but also that of the urban design kind of street level. So before we look too far forward though, we also have to look back and understand the past. we have to recognize that there has been a continual historic push and pull between shared mobility as the dominating driver of urban growth in the US, So with the prevalence of the automobile today in planning and design, it's easy to forget that the US was once one of the leaders of public transit ridership internationally before the dominant rise of Fordism. So while the technology has wildly evolved, obviously today, behavioral and cultural norms might very well have not. In the 1870s, pre-automobile, apart from walking, there were two forms of transit you could take. You could flag down a horse-drawn hansom cab if you could afford the cost, or you could walk to a designated carriage stand and wait for a seat on a horse-drawn tram, traveling on predefined fixed routes. So the first method is pretty much analogous to how taxis and private vehicles operate today, while the second method is essentially modern day public transit, how buses and rail work today. And I bring up this example just to highlight the fact that the issue is time and time again in our history is not necessarily the technology itself, but it's how passenger behavior associated with that technology, and therefore how can we incentivize passengers towards certain modes of transportation depending on how we envision our cities should be planned. So AVs, while certainly new technology, are just another development in this continual historic push and pull between pedestrian transport preferences, transit patterns, and ultimately their effect on the urban form of our cities. And I will argue that the AV has the vast potential to drive mobility in either direction of this graph. If left unregulated to the private market, certainly there is fear that it could be utilized to exacerbate existing mobility trends towards private ownership. But there is great potential also for this technology to catalyze a shift in the other direction. And what impact will the AV have on these behaviors and therefore the actual urban experience of us as citizens of the city? So with any topic so kind of contentious as the AV, we have to really also recognize that this brings up immediate reactions to people. Much of the literature of AV is kind of divided between these two extremes. You have the skeptics on the left, which fear, rightly so, the proliferation of what they call zombie cars, on the road, taking up more traffic, leading to an increase in accidents, taking away job markets linked to driving. But on the other side, you have like the dreamers who effuse on how AVs are going to change the way we live and move around. It will increase productivity due to the fact that you can work in the car. This idea that the AV car and the pedestrian can share the same space without any issue. The streets can become fully democratic, et cetera, without actually providing you with the means or direction to really realistically get to that point. Rather, imagery like on the right is used by private companies developing AV tech to sell the technology to the public, when the likely outcome, if it's left unregulated, is potentially the outcome on the left. So just as the automobile of the mid-20th century caused similar backlash or glorification, we have to acknowledge the skepticism, the fears, but also embrace the challenge of pushing this new infrastructure towards a more positive urbanism, and most importantly, delineating the steps that we can take to get there, because the technology is landing on our streets, no matter if we like it or not. So what first kind of must be crucially highlighted, however, is that the amount of uncertainty that is yet unknown around how our cities will evolve with this technology. So will AVs be majority gasoline or electric? They're assumed by many to be electric, but that's not necessarily the case. Will they still require a measure of human oversight, meaning a human sitting behind the wheel even if they're not driving, which is where the technology stands today, called level 3 or 4? Or will the dream of completely full automation, freeing the car of any drivers, level 5, be reached? Will the vehicle ownership model remain majority private, as it does today, or will we be able to transition to fleet ownership by major corporations and public entities? In either case, will vehicles remain majority single occupancy, or will we be able to transition to a majority multi-occupancy vehicle model? And collectively listed, we realize then that even with the introduction of AVs, if the future evolves into the path delineated on the left, this is essentially the same way we use cars today. Gasoline powered, requiring human oversight, majority privately owned, single occupant vehicles, or in the future with AVs, private automobiles on steroids. The question remains then, what future and therefore what urban development predicated on that future do we aspire towards? Why do I say worst case here on the left, right? Some people might look at this and say, well, what's the problem with how we use cars today? I love the personal convenience that's afforded me to that. But what comes with the convenience of the personal automobile goes hand in hand with documented fundamental root causes of many of the cultural, physical, economic, and environmental issues facing our cities today. Negative externalities from the automobile of the 20th century that generated urban sprawl, a shrunken public realm for pedestrians, traffic congestion, and pollution. These are, root causes of urban issues that have been critiqued by a large body of urban theorists, designers, and economists. Proliferation of automobile transport comes at a significant environmental cost too. Transit-rich cities, often found in Asia and Europe, serve huge urban densities while consuming far less energy, while their American counterparts exhibit an inverse trait. Many of these issues can be traced to the fact that private automobile remains majority single occupancy, despite the physical space in the city allocated to their footprint, while their transit counterparts move people in much more efficient and sustainable ways. The gasoline car, the electric car, the automated car, they still impart the same physical negative externalities on urban form and urban realm if they end up being used in the same way. Another way to look at this relationship is shown here, where this diagram shows the proximate vehicle ranges that are used for varying trip lengths, competing between shared versus private. So what you can see here is that what mobility experts call the last mile gap in this kind of 1 to 5 mile range, which describes the last leg of a journey, comprising the movement of people from where they need to go from where they live, for example, to their final destination, like their home. And it is primarily this gap that is, especially in the US, discourages many people from using public transit because it's not within walking distance or within that range. What you might also notice is that the private car is used for almost every single trip length. And if there were to be a proliferation of the AV into the private mobility sphere, single occupancy, gasoline powered, privately owned, there's a real fear that automation would essentially become cars on steroids, enabling greater urban sprawl, exacerbating congestion, and highlighting mobility inequalities. So to me, I see a huge potential for automation to affect the sphere here, which is having the potential to really revolutionize transit networks around our cities in mobility and cities. So firstly, a whole new range of transit vehicle sizes can be introduced, right? Smaller mini shuttles that can run on flexible service, kind of like how Uber and Lyft run today, and on-demand service, but also all the way up to revolutionizing just existing rapid bus transit, right? And the biggest thing is that the reduction of the driver cost, which accounts for over 60% of the cost of running service in existing transit, rapid and local bus transit, in cities today, would allow an increase in both service frequency and coverage. So I ask again, what future do we aspire towards as architects and designers interested in the urban realm and the future of evolution of the city? This value proposition really must underscore everything we look at as urban designers, all the design work we undertake. And if we do aspire towards this best case scenario, what is the framework for how to reach it? It's easy to imagine a kind of utopic vision of the AV-enabled city without providing a framework for how to reach that future. And so, through policy planning and design, how do we get from the worst case to the best case? And it's really vital as designers of the built realm to take a position so that we can guide the introduction of the AV down that path before it's too late. So in effect, my research speculation argues for the following. Basically that the private car caused public transit to decline historically in the prototypical US city. And now we must use the automated shared car to return us back to public transit as a model of positive urban growth. So the research is really organized into these three larger frameworks. So part one envisions how the mobility model needs to change through key transportation policies that lead us toward this new model. Part two envisions how the everyday person, the everyday citizen of a city would actually experience such a mobility paradigm shift. And part three explores the implications of such a paradigm shift on the actual city of the future for development and urban design. So these parts are not linear, but they critically influence each other and affect each other as a feedback loop as they evolve. So methodologically, my research design argues that the autonomous revolution must be conceptualized both top-down and bottom-up. So top-down regional transit planning models must assimilate the AV into its network or risk it proliferating into the private ownership sector, But at the same time, we have to envision the cultural and behavioral norms as a bottom-up kind of tactical methodology to convince the everyday American that there are alternatives to car culture. So through the format of a graphic novel, the design research speculation will envision the future world through the eyes of the everyday user of such technology. And it is through their eyes that we must imagine an urban environment that evolves more positively for the human, rather than alienating humans, which is something that technology has historically wrought upon the city. I frame this speculation particularly in the utopic lens as I tell the story of the graphic novel in order to create that kind of best case scenario or goal that we can aspire to. And not just we as designers, but the everyday person, even children, can dream of one day achieving. The graphic novel is also a way to combat the historic kind of proliferating celebration of the car in the American imaginary through media campaigns, car adverts, and especially through Hollywood. And it offers an alternative story that might perhaps be read by children and the everyday Angelino, adults who grew up reading comics and are now in position to impact change in the US, for example, and convince them that alternatives to car culture really can exist, that there is hope to transition from the autopia of today to the transitopia of tomorrow. And of course, where better to situate this kind of potential speculation than Hollywood itself. The city of LA, known historically for its love affair with the private automobile, a city where even carpool lane has traffic, where the iconic kind of urban typology is this mid-density urban mat or sprawl. A city Rainer Banham so famously describes in his 4 ecologies, naming one of those ecologies Autopia, the idea that the Angelino drives onto the highway as a way to see and be seen, and reconceptualizing the highway as a spatialized and kind of privatized form of a public spectacle. But ironically, in its civic and historic DNA of LA is something before the car. So this period of LA was the first period of LA from its birth to World War II, is shown here on the left. And the common misperception of LA is that the private automobile caused its sprawl, but that's actually not true. Rather, private land speculation enabled by transit in the form of streetcars and trolleys drove the development of what we call streetcar suburbs that produced the actual mega region of the city. Of the second LA, the LA that produced the stereotypes about cars, traffic congestion, a shrunken civic realm following dismantling of all the rail lines, runs roughly to year 2000. And this is what most of us associate LA kind of predominantly with. So my speculation really places itself within the paradigm of what is called the third LA, which really describes the city as taking real and measurable steps to moving past the freeway and the private car. So now in the third LA, the city is kind of folding back on itself and it's looking to develop more intensely inward. And at the forefront of this emerging city is a massive investment in public transit that began since 1990. In late 2016, voters in LA approved Measure M, which gifted Metro 120 billion over the next 40 years to build a 21st century public transit system until year 2047. However, when I was diving into this, I realized current Measure M's budgeting and messaging has really focused primarily on the expansion of its light rail network. However, statistics show that 80% of transit riders in the city take the bus. And of these bus riders, 92% are people of color and lower income. So unintentionally or not, Metro's kind of obsession with the light rail, a mode that targets more upper income residents of the city, comes at an opportunity cost of servicing and expanding the city's bus network, a service that hasn't really seen a major upgrade in over 20 years. So improving bus service is fundamentally a question of equity. At the same time, public transit agencies are really slow to react to fast landing tech, as public agencies do, especially a city as large as LA, where future transit models have, of course, not yet really incorporated autonomous vehicles into their thinking. So this is a huge opportunity for me, I saw as a designer, where I can really step in and actually begin to speculate on how Measure M might begin to integrate future automation and what might that model become. And how might that model actually guide a more positive version of the city that we aspire toward? So mapping the existing LA kind of transit network reveals a monocentric downtown-oriented rail network that has been overlaid on the Jeffersonian grid of the city, which is reflected in its kind of grid network of bus routes. But we know that LA is actually a prime example of a polynucleated city, which means that it has multiple job centers scattered metropolitan-wide. The grid paradigm of the city, the Jeffersonian grid, however, means that often when traveling from polynucleated center to center, transfer between grid axes are unavoidable and therefore inefficient. So in the new model that I'm proposing then, polynucleated centers are first hierarchically connected by new autonomous rapid transit, which could be free of cost, subsidized by things like congestion pricing, for example. And these BRTs could serve as precursors to the light rail, the first step in implementing kind of transit spoke corridors that facilitate direct connections between polynucleated city centers. Then fixed route local bus service and frequency is intensified around these existing hubs, filling in the kind of 3 to 5 last mile mobility gap and creating a blueprint for intensification of urban growth and land use around these polynucleated centers. And lastly, areas between these centers, areas of low density that traditionally don't have enough density and ridership to support fixed route transit, are serviced by flexible on-demand automated transit mini shuttles, similar to how transit network companies or TNCs like Uber and Lyft work today. Played out on the actual transit paradigm of LA, this results in a new model that cannot be categorized as either hub or spoke, nor as a grid, yet exhibits characteristics of both. And Rather, the new AV incorporated transit model much more accurately reflects the polynucleated nature of the city of LA, which is a city that does not have the defined kind of monocentric, as defined a monocentric downtown core that most other cities do. And it transitions the kind of mononucleated grid model of today towards a polynucleated spoke model that reinforces these job centers. Zooming into this model, the new transit hierarchies and trip chaining are implemented. So first, light rail is number 1, then BRT becomes the service line precursor to that forms the backbone of these new connections between these cores. And then overlaid on top of the existing local bus network of the city is number 3. And then a series of automated smaller fixed route shuttles at number 4 at a high density of coverage and frequency service these kind of core districts in zone B shown here. And finally, an automated flex and on-demand mini transit shuttle service, number 5, services the lowest densities, single family suburbs or single to mid-range densities. Low occupancy vehicles are disincentivized from being used for longer distance commute by the presence of transport zone fees, for example, when crossing, zone C boundaries, which I've outlined here. And they work in tandem to support the use of rail and bus rapid transit for long distance commute, while smaller automated vehicle sizes are used for these medium to short range trips. So given the all-encompassing nature of this kind of top-down transit paradigm shift, it's also crucial to understand how this top-down network is used bottom-up by vastly different Angelino households whose commute types, trip patterns, and different mobility needs are impacted. Collated together, they demonstrate a wide capacity of the new automated network to get citizens of the city all around the city for a variety of all their distinctive needs. So these 5 archetypes utilize this new transit in very different ways based on the different places they live, work, and run errands. So in a day in their life takes them across many geographies and job centers as they interact both with each other and with the network. And each of these households also represents widely varying incomes, demographics, family structures, aiming to represent the majority of the Angelino population, from the upper income suburban nuclear family to the lower income family whose commute lengths are vast, to the younger millennials who bike the city, and even to visiting business travelers who use the city in different ways. And these narratives shows 5 distinct kind of distinct experiences that the automation paradigm shift has occurred in what I'm envisioning in LA of 2047. And so each of these stories shows how automated transit has actually improved their lives in key and noticeable ways. And a lot of these topics that I dive into are listed here. So, this is quite an extensive of a novel that I'm not going to be able to go into every single story, but I do want to go through 2 of these today, 2 really important ones. The first of the suburban nuclear family, which really illustrates how one would use this transport model. And this new one called the Transit Planner, which I've actually been developing for the past year, which really looks at issues of transportation equity and larger kind of metropolitan restructuring of the city due to the AV. So the first story follows the Smiths, what I'm calling the suburban nuclear family, in the year 2009, 2020, the Smiths owned 2 cars, and despite complaining about ever worsening LA traffic, there was really no other mobility alternative that could rival their personal automobile. But their story begins with a nightmare, so that if automation reduces occupancy of cars to 0, it may result in a proliferation of zombie cars on the road. Empty cars that drive around looking for passengers to pick up or double parking on city streets, exacerbating congestion and traffic flows. Thankfully, in this future world, the transit paradigm has occurred. So the Smith family has sold their last car, facilitated by the policy implementation of congestion pricing in the city, which levies driving tolls dynamically to congested areas of the city. So an automated school bus here picks up kids from home, while the working mom, Mrs. Smith, calls a flex on-demand transit mini shuttle to the metro station. Here, in this future, the typical suburban block has densified with accessory dwelling units, or ADUs, as part of a citywide rezoning strategy, as driveways and street parking becomes obsolete and underutilized front yards and driveways densify. This has allowed the street to be reclaimed for public use and landscaping, while flexible AV pickup zones consolidate 2 to 3 homes, which still allows the convenience of point-to-point mobility. Mrs. Smith Flex AV has picked up one of her coworkers, Jenny, who is off to work as well. And as they arrive at an intermodal transfer station, the transfer experience has been vastly improved. Transit wait times have been drastically reduced. So Mrs. Smith tries to convince Jenny that their needs for owning a car is gone, which allows their family to add an addition to the home like they always wanted, as they walk from the metro stop under a covered shelter to the office building in downtown. Meanwhile, Mr. Smith begins his day by stopping by a local grocery store to run errands. Because of his desire to avoid carrying groceries, he calls a Flex AV transit shuttle to take him home. So while he is charged a higher trip fee for such a convenience, it is able to allow him to replace the convenience of owning a personal car with the same type of point-to-point service. And because it is used for short distance, he is able to avoid crossing and paying the polynucleated transport zone fee. On the way home, Mr. Smith adds a stop to pick up some fast food for lunch. So one of the most infamous building types invented from the rise of the automobile, oriented primarily around the spatial queuing constraints of the car, the fast food, typology. This typology has now transformed in 2047. Because automation reduces the need for parking, the parking lot has been readapted. A new restaurant extension activates a newly created public space that is integrated with the sidewalk, while AV drop-off zones are integrated with the building entrance. Meanwhile, back at work, Mrs. Smith and her colleague debate the best way to get to their midday work meeting in Century City. And they decide that automated BRT is both the cheapest and the fastest option. And in this future, the bus is integrated to the Metro app, which Jenny is able to ping the incoming bus, reserve seats, as well as geolocate when the bus is arriving. Inside the bus, the experience has been upgraded, while AV BRTs receive priority and fast passage on HOV lanes and highways. When Mrs. Smith and her colleague transfers between 2 BRT stations, the transfer station has been vastly improved, along with the entire kind of street composition, restructuring of the street. Bus stops are covered and integrated with adjacent urban form, as well as activated by small-scale programming, retail, and other amenities while passengers wait for the bus. Sheltered road medians ensure easy crossing and a covered pedestrian transfer experience. Later that night, the Smith family meets in Culver City for dinner, and because both parents don't need to worry about driving, they can indulge in drinks. They call an on-demand AV transit shuttle home, and that gives them a price discount due to the vehicle being high occupancy. By the end of the day, a summary of the day's trip charges is displayed on their Metro app, and it shows how transit in the city is able to rival the average cost of owning a car per day. And this day has demonstrated, the shift towards transit as a model of mobility in the city is not only economically possible, but behaviorally even desirable, even in low density suburbs with families and lifestyles that demand the convenience of point-to-point travel. So the second story I want to share is one that really focuses on issues of transit equity. And it does this through the lens of a city transit planner as she conducts a public engagement meeting with local residents of the city that are directly impacted by automation. And here we can really use this narrative to tackle head-on issues of transportation inequalities that in the history of LA and North American cities at large have really seen, and how we can potentially use automation to to rectify, address, and improve conditions for those that have historically been disadvantaged by new technology. So Ms. Reynolds, our hypothetical transit planner, begins her story by welcoming everyone to the town hall meeting, and explaining how, since AV buses and automated transit has decreased the use of privately owned vehicles, key freeways have been able to be reclaimed at the metropolitan level and converted to ecological green spines and public spaces. At the same time, emphasis has been shifted to fixed and flex route AVs with a dramatic increase in stops and services. She shows an image of this radical conversion of the former 405 freeway into an ecological green spine that functions as public space with urban forests, but also an ecological waterway for sustainability and resilience. This converted spine also serves as a transit corridor that encourages new densification along its edge. So where previously the highway divided neighborhoods, especially neighborhoods of lower income, through redlining, with buildings turning their back to the noise, pollution, and traffic of the highway, the same footprint can now be flipped, becoming a way to stitch communities back together with urban amenities. This might seem like a kind of radical idea, but it really has a lot of precedence around the world already in today. Some of you may know of the Cheonggyecheong restoration in Seoul, South Korea, where a major overpass highway cutting through the city was removed and restored back to a public greenway and waterway with the restored kind of channelized stream to great acclaim and success. And it's hard not to imagine how something like that could actually happen in the US given the right vision and implementation. So Ms. Reynolds then talks about how she met with local residents at a new station typology that the city has begun construction on. So where previously the bus rapid transit stops were stranded on islands in the middle of the freeways, which is a current condition in LA, the city has now decked over an underpass highway, with a new kind of hybrid public space and transit stop that literally bridges two communities back together, with amenities like sports and recreation, a community center, and even new affordable housing and a retail main street. At this on-the-ground meeting, she talks with local residents who talk to her about a new community improvement district initiative that has impacted their neighborhoods in a positive way. In high traffic intersections like Crenshaw Boulevard, the reduction of vehicle demand has allowed previous multi-lane road right-of-ways to be converted to public space. This community improvement district plan, which I call a CAD, which is an alternative form of development to BIDs or business improvement districts, allows for reinvestment of property tax back into the same community it's taxed from, with decisions chaired by a community board that's made up of members of that same community. Hand in hand with this idea of the CID is the idea that streets are a public community good and should be treated as such. So streets as a play space or front yard of communities and can be reclaimed for public use rather than just a private vehicle. And here, Ms. Reynolds explains how playgrounds, gathering places, walkable and amenity-dense community services will be implemented at the ground level through this idea of the CID community loop, where development on outer, more commercial corridors protects the interior blocks consisting of single family housing, more typical of LA urban grain, and how that can be protected from development gentrification. Property taxes on these outer development corridors goes directly into funding community-driven public and street space improvements on the interior. And of course, as Ms. Reynolds talks, the community voices much of its concern about how things sound expensive, who is supposed to pay for all of this, gentrification concerns, but slowly members of the community board in other districts begin to testify how these initiatives have begun to see positive effects in their particular communities. For example, around the Jefferson area, she details how former housing that was created for the 2024 Olympic has been converted into new model of affordable housing centered around access to affordable transit enabled by the AV. At the same time, reduction of parking needs due to automation, especially in a city like LA, where parking makes up such a large percentage of its open unbuilt space, means that there is new opportunities for affordable housing linked to transit-oriented development that's integrated with AV drop-off zones and transit stops and an improved public streetscape. And so slowly the community comes around and begins to buy into the vision that's presented here and the transformative power of automation to actually improve their lives in distinct ways. So Ms. Reynolds explains how important it is that the community have a direct input into the transformation of their neighborhoods. With this new transit paradigm comes a new responsibility to protect communities, to ensure that redlining and the inequities of the past are not repeated in the future. And this is really the vision for the new LA. So the remaining archetypes, they really illustrate, tackle different issues when it comes to automation. For example, the composite household looks at more about the larger restructuring of the street section and other urban form changes. The business travel story looks more about the actual business model of the paradigm shift towards mobility as a service through potential public-private partnerships and private mobility companies that could operate under oversight by public agencies. And the extended working household looks specifically at how maybe new labor or service shifts could be affected by this new kind of market. So mobility and technology. So what I love about this format, if I can speak to like graphic novel a little bit, is that it really allows me to touch upon, think about, and critique and imagine things that are not necessarily typically in our immediate realm of urban design or architecture, which is the physical design of the city. So mobility and new technology is not just about the street. It's not just about the street section or the physical design of urban space, but it's actually also how you experience it. So from the moment you decide what mode of transportation you want to take to get around in the city, to the technology that you interact with to get you where you want to go, like apps or your phone, that experience is really just as key to the actual design of the city. And this format really allows me to be malleable, to be able to critique and improve suggestions to that experience, just as much as it allows me to envision the urban form and the typology and the metropolitan changes that will potentially occur with this new typology. And very important is embedded with this kind of storytelling is a set of underlying values and value systems that will guide this future. So this is really super important to us as designers and architects, is to embed our work with a value system and to measure and evaluate decisions that we make against these values and goals. Otherwise, it's easy to become subsumed or perpetuate the status quo. So for this research, I suggest that the AV must disrupt, support, catalyze, and incentivize ride sharing by filling existing mobility gaps. It has to rival point-to-point service by shifting mobility to a service model and integrate mobility into seamless trip chains. And this would allow us then to rethink how urban growth pattern of the city might evolve. And just as important as the actual physical design of the space of the city, the kind of utopic vision that the graphic novel kind of tells, there also has to come hand in hand with a set of key kind of concrete transport policies that will allow us to get to that city of tomorrow from the city of today. So many of these listed here have been proven successful in cities around the world, but they need to be adapted and configured for the cultural and political context of the US. And these policies can be categorized as both incentives for modal shift, what I'm calling carrots, but also important rules or sticks that need to be enforced to induce behavioral shift. You can't only provide carrots because Angelinas might still never switch to transit, even if it's vastly improved, but you can't only enforce sticks like congestion pricing or the vehicle certificate of entitlements without providing a better alternative to the car than there exists now. So these policies go hand in hand with this new model, and they also enable this kind of cultural shift that the graphic novel illustrates to occur. These levers might be manipulated and adjusted over time depending on how effective they are. And many of the stories kind of touch upon some of the potential for some of these policies to be implemented. And so given this utopic future of LA, how do we know how we got there? So I've also laid out kind of several key metrics of success that we have to identify. And many of these are kind of goals, metric goals are based off of the success of other transit-rich cities around the world. Some of the important ones are the idea of transit mode share that must shift dramatically, and I'm saying like perhaps 60%, which is what New York has, where 60% use transit, while that number is actually far exceeded in cities like Hong Kong or Zurich around the world. While the actual transit trip, the number of transit trip has to reverse the recent trend of TNCs like Uber and Lyft that are shown to be competing and drawing users directly from transit. So lastly, this design research speculation lays out key implications of how this new transit model can affect the urban design and planning professions and real implications for the city of the future. So many of these are detailed in the stories and achievable by the aforementioned transport policies. But these are lessons that we have to take away with us if we really want to guide the future of the AV down this path. And the most powerful implication, which leads me with my final point as I wrap up, which is that in all cities, urban development patterns are inseparable from the evolution of urban mobility. Urban transport can never be considered independently from urban form. So denser, more walkable, and more human-friendly urban environments are produced from a cycle of feedback loops that influence each other. And it is the fundamental belief of mine that as one of the many levers of influence on the city that we create, changing the way we move around the city fundamentally changes the type of city we get. So LA's transition to this new transit paradigm results in a blueprint for a radical reconceptual shift in the future densification of the city. As the city turns inward, away from outward expansion of the second and first LAs, future development paradigms of the third LA have the opportunity to develop in clusters around this new transit hierarchy in which denser urban form, retail clusters, and businesses accumulate around these new polynucleated zones. And if urban growth patterns were to do so in this way, LA would transition from a car-oriented city to one that is much more mixed use, dense, and walkable, transforming the urban structure of the entire region for decades to come. It's an urban structure that's neither produced from the first LA nor the second, but kind of a transmutation of both in its third era. Situated within a long lineage of urban utopias that have provided blueprints for urban growth, this new polynucleated spoke model is neither a true hub and spoke like the Garden City, which was self-contained and bounded, nor Doxiadis' acoustics model of human settlement, nor a true grid paradigm like Frank Lloyd Wright's Broad Acre City, but rather exhibits characteristics of all three. And a transmutation into this new paradigm results in a blueprint for a radical reconceptual shift in this future densification of the city. So this design research speculation that I presented today takes the form of a three-part series: the automation model, the experience, and its implications in the future city. And each of these parts describe obviously more in detail what I've gone to today. But the idea is that these series of books, or these three books, should be read together as one, but they could also be distributed to a variety of different constituents and stakeholders, from the LA transit planner to the transport policymaker, to the academic, and just as importantly, to the everyday citizen of the city. So I think the key point to make here is, since we as designers and architects, our work is primarily about physical space, but we also need to think holistically about systems, interrelated networks, experiences, policy, politics, and governance if we want to affect broad change in the urban environment. And in order to affect change, we have to be adept at speaking to different target audiences that can affect that change, because it will take all of those constituents and stakeholders to do so. You need transit planners to affect change from top down, but you also need the actual community members and citizen dwellers of the city from a bottom-up perspective to buy into that change and to adjust the way they behaviorally use new technology. And you also need the designers and architects and developers of the built realm to understand how to produce better form that can link these two. So part of my research thinking is to gear the output of this research so that it's nimble enough to address all these different stakeholders. And to touch a bit on this medium and the dissemination of this research, I had the opportunity to display this research at a couple international biennales in the past 2 years. And specifically this idea of the ground up, where the idea for me is to really begin to instigate a culture change in the way away from kind of the 20th century love of the car, and to convince the everyday person who might go to an exhibition like this, who are not really trained to think about architecture or urban design in the way we think about it, to talk in a medium or a form of a graphic novel that they might understand more readily, and disseminate that information in a way that they might understand. And this is maybe one step towards that. And also to prepare research like this to be distributed in many languages. So here at the Shenzhen Biennale, I had the entire novel translated to Chinese. And to speak to an audience internationally that maybe is facing many of the same urban growth questions that other cities had faced in previous decades. And lastly, I want to touch a bit on just the idea of post-pandemic planning, which is ever more important today, how outdoor public space is used. in big cities, we almost saw proof of concept of this idea that if demand for cars and vehicular travel decreases, as it did this past year after COVID, streets can be reclaimed back for public space. Don't let traffic engineers tell you otherwise. It took a pandemic to finally act as an impetus towards this reclamation. But the vision is that if we can get AVs to reduce private vehicular demand, just as the pandemic did, we can place value again on the public realm for human use. So I think that pretty much wraps up my time. And I'm ending on the questions that Maria started with. And I hope I've addressed most of these implicitly or explicitly, but I think it's a great way to, I guess, kickstart our discussion and conversation around maybe some of these points. Thank you so much again.